All right, hello everyone, happy summer. I'm going to call this Board Finance Committee meeting on August 13th to order at 6:08 p.m. We have one major agenda item tonight around the budget, and so we'll just get to it. I appreciate everybody coming. Do you want to do the roll call first?
Oh. Cohen? Here. Chow?
Here. So the first item of business is the action item. The Finance Committee recommends that the minutes, I'm going to push this back, it sounds very loud. Oh, we're not live yet. The Finance Committee recommends that the minutes of the June 4th, 2018 Finance Committee meeting be approved as presented. Are there any amendments?
Second. Cohen? Yes. Chow?
Yes. Motion carries. So, we have, as I said before, our primary and only agenda item is discussion of the 2019 budget. And I'm sure Raphael and Kathy will talk about how the budget process will proceed. I think the board is seeing it in September for final approval, but we're going through multiple iterations. Welcome, Rebecca. So I will just turn it over to you all. And Paul, did you have anything else?
I did not. We're happy to start this conversation here. We will be bringing the formal budget to the board later on. We also, and my colleagues will talk about how we'll be reaching out into the community as well to do several sessions in the community for those who are interested, and we would hope that everybody's interested and that they would show up. But you guys can talk about that.
Okay. Well, thank you, Dr. Garn. So tonight we will be presenting tentative budget. A draft tentative budget was presented in June. And this is our outline. We're going to be talking briefly about legal requirements. We will revisit actual revenues and expenditures, which have look slightly different, better than they did in June. We will talk about FY19 budget revenues and expenditures. Park School, which is one of our schools, but actually a separate district. We'll talk about updated financial projections and structural deficit and budget uncertainties. So let me start with legal requirements. As a public school district, we are required to have our budget adopted by the end of the first quarter, which ends September 30th. We will be adopting our budget on September 24th. The budget will be on display. Tentative, not final budget, will be on display for 30 days, and the board will vote on it the same day the hearing will take place. And as Dr. Gorin mentioned, that there will be 3 community presentations in the week of September 3rd. So our public will have a chance to ask us questions, and information will be posted on our website. So let's begin with FY18 actuals. So we did very well with operating revenues. We actually collected 1% of our budget and spent 97% of our expenditures. So as a result, the operating surplus is bigger than what we budgeted. And what contributes, and this surplus will be, of course, preserved, will be kept in our referendum reserves to use to balance future deficit budgets. So really 2 elements, I know this is kind of hard to see, 2 elements of why we have additional surplus. So on the left side, revenues, you can see that the red bar, which represents actual revenues, exceeded the budget. And it's primarily because of interest income way over our budget due to rising interest rates. I mean, interest rates are rising basically every week now, and as it's not very good to consumers, but it's good to school districts because we collect extra revenues, but also because of the state. And I'm sure there's a correlation with the legislative changes of the way the state funds education, but we were able to collect late payments that state was, I think it was behind almost 10 years in paying. So they were playing this game, and last year they decided to give us 5 payments, which is very, very unusual. It happened only one time in I think like last 12 years. But that's the reason why we collected almost $2 million more. One payment is an equivalent to almost $2 million. So we got the money, which is wonderful. And on the expenditures side, at the same time, we got some savings. So in addition to some vacant positions that were put in the budget, but for various reasons unfilled, so the enrollment, we had, for example, Arabic language teacher, the enrollment did not materialize at the last moment. We had positions that were also hard to fill. We also, FY18 budget had over 30 positions which were estimated in the budget. Not all the positions were filled at the time of the adoption, so there were a lot of savings. And also we had other efficiencies, operating efficiencies, so all of that, as you can see, contributed to additional savings. So we can keep more money in our reserves, which again will be used later to cover deficit budgets. Moving to the budget. This is the 17th consecutive balanced budget. Of course, it's balanced, and it's based on 66, its enrollment is higher by 66 students, and it's aligned, the spending is aligned with the district's strategic priorities, which include new science adoption, strengthening of the intervention programs, recruitment initiatives, just to give you few. The whole list is included in the documents that are also posted on our website. The district is also committed to equity and instructional technology. Moving to the revenues, just want to point out a few things. Overall revenues are projected to decrease by 5%. And that does not mean that we're going to be losing money or something is going to be cut. It simply means that when the referendum was passed, the way the money was distributed to us by the county, instead of received in FY17 a little bit and then FY18, it was given to us all in FY18. So in a way we got 22 million, one time and a half of the revenues, which creates this very unequal distribution. And it looks like we're going to be getting less money, but no, it's actuality we're getting more money because the CPI is working, which affects the growth of the property taxes, 2.1%, which is very high. But that's how the numbers are falling. I also want to point out that evidence-based funding, which replaced general state aid, is projected to stay flat. Unless our enrollment changes dramatically, we should be getting the same amount of money. And because our district is at tier 3, we should also have access to some additional money. We don't know if the state's going to have money, actually cash, to pay the extra money that they call extra money. But last year we actually received $220,000.
Just want to clarify that when the voters generously passed the referendum, they generously passed the ability for us to receive $14.5 million a year. That first year where we got the $22 million, we knew we were going to get that. That wasn't a surprise. It wasn't a surprise payment of extra dollars. It was in the budget. It was in the budget, and it was planned for, and it's planned for over what we see as the 8 years of using referendum dollars so that we don't go into the red. So I just want to make sure that we're clear. This isn't extra resource.
Right.
This is the resource that we were generously given by the voters.
Thank you. So this pie chart illustrates our operating revenues, and you can see that we rely heavily on property taxes. This is very typical for our geographical areas. The next chart, property taxes, the growth in property taxes is determined, as I said, by CPI. And This slide illustrates Consumer Price Index, CPI, history, and projection. As you can see, these factors were not very high. Actually, we've been very lucky last 2 years, 2016 and 2017, 2.1. This is actually very high in comparison to 2 prior CPI factors, which were under 1%. This slide compares FY19 budget to FY18 actuals. And you can see where these changes are taking place. So I mentioned that property tax uneven distribution, that's why you see the red bar slightly lower. Other local revenues, they are also lower next year. And it's because we are not getting a TIF surplus from the city of Evanston. And one of our grants, Noise Foundation grant, is expiring. We will be getting other smaller grants for that program, for Evanston program, but this particular grant was a 3-year grant, ended. State revenues, again, looks like we are losing money. It's not. It's the 5 payments, again, late payments versus normal allocation of 4. Moving to expenditures. Overall expenditures are increasing by 7%. And it's actually a little bit misleading because 1 million, it's 7. I'm sorry, it's 7%, and it's a little bit misleading. It's actually 6% because 1 million of the new revenues is the, expenditures is the expenditure from last year that we did not spend. It's the capital, 1,025,000, that was outlined by the board resolution of the referendum money that will be spent every single year on capital projects, but because of the timing of the projects, we couldn't prepay these projects. The projects are they're actually ending right now. That's why that money was taken and placed in the FY19 budget. Also, another reason for the increase is the staffing. We have new positions, we have contractual increases. Some of the student services, unfortunately, are going up. Head Start transportation is increasing by, I believe, 60-some%, and other services are increasing as well. Also, special education tuition, 11% increase. It's been going up steadily. I mentioned the new positions. There's actually 19.5 FTEs in the budget, and some positions are added due to enrollment, increasing enrollment and programmatic needs. Some other ones are due to efficiencies. We also have 3 that are supporting district strategic initiatives. But overall, we're adding 6 teachers, 2 TAs, 4 coaches, 1 director, 1.5 coordinator, 1 admin support, and 4 custodians. And some of these positions were actually outlined in the resolution, in the referendum resolution. Some of them are paid by grant funding, and some of them, like the 4 custodians, are budget neutral. Actually, we're going to be saving money with these positions because we're going to be replacing our temporary positions, and again, just saving money by making all these changes. This is this pie chart represents our operating expenditures, and you can see 80% of our expenses goes to pay for staffing, which is again very typical, but it's a lion's share of our expenditures. So if we and that's why every time we talk about reduction, unfortunately, we have to talk about our staffing. Okay, this slide compares FY19 budget to FY18 actuals. Same thing for those of you who prefer visual charts versus tables. You can see where these increases are taking place. Personnel, the positions, and the contractual increases. We also have an increase in purchase services. That's the transportation services that I mentioned, additional legal services, and capital outlay, which is really not an increase because over 2 years, we're gonna be spending the same $2,050,000. It's just the way it's divided. It's 0, 2 million versus $1,025,000 and $1,025,000. This table you saw in June. This is a summary of our efficiencies, mainly in the buildings and grounds area. And we're also going to be saving our taxpayers over $360,000 due to price negotiations for medical insurance. And again, premiums will be going down actually by 4% this year. We typically talk about expenditures by object, by category, salaries, benefits. This is a different representation of these expenditures. It's actually by the function, what function these expenditures serve. And you can see that 50% of our expenditures is actually spent on instruction, which is the way it should be. That's where our teacher salaries are placed, teacher assistants. But we also spend 20% on student services. These are social workers, psychologists, transportation, and so on. Facilities, that's of course the maintenance of our buildings. Admin support of schools, that's salaries of our principals, vice principals, and secretaries. And I'm saying it because I know you've seen these terms over the years, but sometimes people just don't know what's in it because these are very large categories. Administrative support for general, this is the cost of central administration and services and community services. We actually spend, as a district, 5% on community services, which includes Head Start and childcare. We have a short slide on Park School. I mentioned that even though it's one of our schools, it's actually a separate budget. And this year, the net cost of Park School will be going down by 2%. Park School is managed and funded by districts 202 and 65. And in our budget, if you go line by line in the expenditure reports, you will see a line that's called net cost of Park School. That's what it is. It's actually broken into 3 places, but District 65 spends $1.4 million out of its budget for Park School. Which brings us to projections. And these look very similar to what was presented in June. We are still balanced with our reserves through FY25, but I would like to point out that we actually will be starting deficit budgets in FY22, and that's what this arrow on the bottom of the slide points to. So yes, we have through FY25, that hasn't changed, but true deficit budgets are starting much sooner, which means that we're going to be cutting into our referendum reserves. That's the money that we put aside. That's the extra $4 million that we added this last year in FY18. That's going to be diminishing very slowly. And that's why I used the 2 colors, red, spending, and saving. Because when you think about it, FY22 is around the corner. And we have to make sure that, and this is the same thing, just as a bar graph, for those of you who are visual, the green portion, the referendum reserves, are diminishing starting FY22. And our goal as a district is to keep that green steady. Because, let me go back to this slide. Actually, this slide right here. Sorry, this slide. The number in the corner, 5.5 in the lower right corner, 5.5 million. That's the amount of the referendum reserves at the end of FY25. I know that there is a big deficit in FY26. There is nearly not enough to cover that deficit. So we have to, as a district and as a community, do everything that we can to make it bigger and not use these referendum reserves. And why are these diminishing? Why are they being used? Well, because of structural deficit. And I know we've been hearing that term for the last 2 years. I know Dr. Gorn has been talking about extensively. And it's happening because the rate of growth in our expenditures is going higher. That's the red line. Than the rate of growth in our revenues. So, and it's very important to remember that it's not the amount that we're talking about, because you could have a surplus budget, but still have a structural deficit. And the whole point is to make these two even. So, going again back to this slide. On this slide, and again, this is just representation of our projections, our revenues, and we know they're going to change. We know that because CPIs are being released, so of course this is not written in stone. Right now, the rate of increasing revenue is about 2%. We know it's not going to go up to 4%. I mean, we know it's not going to happen. Even if the CPI is good, meaning 2% or 3%. But if you look at the red line, expenditures, it's around 4%. So we need to make that gap smaller. And how do we do it? Well, we continue to develop zero-based budget where we look at every single line. We follow the board's resolution, which restricts how we spend referendum reserves. We continue working on priority based budgeting, but not by adding additional programs, but realigning existing dollars to our strategic priorities. Same with new programs and new positions. We have to really, really review these positions and make sure that they bring instructional value. And to fund them, we have to shift the dollars, maybe from the programs that do not provide the same instructional value. So that's what we're going to be doing, probably starting this fall. And unfortunately, it's a complex and lengthy process. And so we're going to be bringing more information to you. And I included a copy of the resolution, which I know you know it by heart because it's in every presentation. And there is still additional uncertainties that we do not have answers to. There is still a looming cost shift, even though it was removed from the budget, but it's included in the projections. There's still unknown with the property tax freeze, and if that's approved, we're gonna lose probably $3 million the first year it happens. But because it's not part of the budget, of course there's no point to include it in the projections. But we're watching all these things. We know that the contracts are ending in FY19 and FY20. We don't know what's gonna happen with the benefits. We don't know what's gonna happen with federal funding. I mean, look what's happening with Medicaid. The state is holding over $1 million of our funds, and we cannot get our hands on it. We don't even have a certainty if we're gonna be able to balance FY25. So there's just a lot of questions, but we're gonna be monitoring these things for you and bringing you the information and updating you. And this is the calendar of what's gonna happen. In September, again, community budget presentations and public hearing and the budget adoption in September. Are there any questions?
Sure there are questions. Who wants to start?
I have a quick question, actually. Maybe it's not quick, I don't know why I always say that, but the CPI factor, do we think that might be conservative, given what we see happening with the interest rate right now?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the CPI is actually at 2.9,
yeah.
And between ourselves, we think it may be higher than 1.5, but I don't know if you remember, in 2008, the CPI was close to 5% in July, and then it plummeted to 0.1. Because 1.5 approximately is our average for 10 years and for 5 years, I personally think that would be irresponsible for us to, I mean, obviously we want the highest CPI possible, but,
Sure.
But at this point, I think it's prudent to be conservative because it's always easy to increase it up versus just blue sky the situation and take something down.
There's another piece of this too, which is related to our fund balance, and it's related to our fund balance not necessarily with the referendum dollars, but writ large, that we want to have somewhere, for public entities, we want to have somewhere between 25 and 40% of our operating budget in a fund balance, so that then if we are going to go out and borrow, our borrowing costs would be lower. So the conservative nature also preserves those resources over time as we carefully monitor what's going on. And we really don't know what's going to happen to the economy.
Sure, I was just wondering if,
But I hear you, and I knew that this question would come up, because I mean, you look at the even interest rates that the bank offers, right? And it's not the rates that it used to be. The rates are going higher. But again, we want to be conservative.
understood.
So at some point though, because, year end, we will know what this year's CPI will be, which will affect the levy and
the FY20.
And the FY20.
Right.
So at that point is when, in spring, early spring or late winter is when we would revise the projections, correct?
Yes, we always revise the projections. So the CPI, the annual December CPI comes out in mid-January, and every February we present updated, that's really the reason, because we wait for this annual CPI to come out. And I mean, the good thing is, the future CPI does not, the CPI does not affect the current budget. It affects projections only. We know what the CPI is for this budget.
We know what it is for this levy, for the 2018 levy.
So for next year's budget.
2018 levy, which is going to be 18 and 19. No, actually 19 and 20.
20.
It's 2.1. But to your point, the levy for levy year 19 is probably going to be higher than 2.1 because I think it'll probably be closer to 3%. But when you do revenue projection, you want to be very conservative with what you come out with, because you don't want any nasty surprises. Where we make decisions and projection based on that.
Sure.
That builds on future years. And then we have to walk it back and it just looks bad.
Totally understood. I'm just, it's out of my own odd curiosity just to understand what happens with a point moving up and down to the CPI and how greatly that affects our revenues. That's just a point that I can take offline. That would be interesting to know the answer to, but certainly doesn't require.
And 1% means a lot to us, about 800,000. So if it's great, if it's 3%, our projection is going to look much better.
But we have to understand too, though, this is the only time starting this budget year that we actually have a connection between salary increases and CPI as well. So ostensibly, even as the CPI goes up and you would redo those two charts, right? So the top line of revenue, or the revenue line would go up some more, but the expense line would go up some more too, because they're correlated, and they haven't been correlated in the past. So.
That's right.
I have two questions.
Yeah.
One was, we've seen the chart that's on page 12, the updated financial projections chart. We utilized that one quite a bit during the referendum, and I think there was built-in information for the uncertainties of pension cost shift, as well as property tax freeze. And we had factored that into how we thought about our long-term projections. And since those are no longer, those are uncertainties that we're not necessarily anticipating in the same way, I'm wondering how our long-term projections might be different and how this chart has changed based on that information. Do we have that?
So property tax was never really in our financial projections. We were always watching it, but it was in this additional tables because the impact of that would be huge, and it would really look, the numbers would look devastating, and I think could be misleading for the reader. We do have pension shift cost in our projections. It was actually in the draft tentative budget, but because it was not part of the state budget, it was removed from the budget, but not from projections. So actually starting with FY20, you do have 0.5% of that built in, which is about 350,000, and then it doubles for the total amount of 2%, which is about 1.7%. So actually that,
7 million.
it's included, it's included.
So it would be in the expenditure line.
Correct,
So it's collapsed into that expenditure line,
yes.
inclusion of that as a hedge effectively.
Total expenditures?
Mm-hmm.
Correct. It's just not parsed out, but if we
could parse
want,
it
we
out,
could parse
but
it out
it's-
in the
I
future,
think
because
in
it's a good
terms of
question.
comparing the information, it would be
Absolutely,
useful.
we can add it to.
Just to follow through on Anya's question, I want to be careful about this, but can we guesstimate what a property tax freeze might do? I mean,
We
what,
could.
you know,
We actually did it in the past. We had
done that, and that's
tables
your point.
with the impact.
But what we want to do, we want
Passed.
to be careful, if the legislation doesn't pass, we don't put it in.
Right. What I'm looking for in particular is just the ability to track the information from what our concerns were prior to the referendum passing to where we are now in
it's a fair question.
that 8-year
Yeah.
window that we were looking at, so that we have kind of a one-to-one comparison to make. That's what I was looking for. And the other question that I had was, we talked about this at the finance meeting that I think I was at maybe in March. But when we look at I think is it the evidence-based budgeting that we're gonna be talking about at finance? That we also have a clear equity lens in how instructional value, how we're assessing instructional value in terms of programs and positions.
Priority-based budgeting, right.
Okay,
Right, I think that's,
yeah. Those are my two comments, questions.
Thanks, Anya. Joey?
I have a question, it might be rhetorical. The last bullet on page 14 slide,
Can you pull the mic over a little bit?
the last bullet that says develop new budget policies that will scrutinize new positions and programs for its instructional value. I'm curious when you think the team, the educational team, might have recommendations for the board as to the best way to move forward with looking at those things. I mean, developing policy is one thing in our role, but I'd be curious to know, you talk about structural deficits, what are your keen lenses seeing when looking at the organization and where you think we can do better, and certainly where policy can drive some of those decisions. And I know that's a heavy weighted question, so maybe there's not an answer for today, but like in a timeline, is that this year? Is that after we successfully negotiate a contract with our teachers? Is that when there's space to have a clear-headed conversation? Is that something within the next 2 years? Where do you see that coming into play? Because it's a great goal, but that's going to be a pretty heavy conversation.
So I see it, and we haven't actually gone to the deep dive of how to do this. I think step one is to faithfully negotiate our contracts and make sure that we do that well. And then two is that it's a several-year process, and I think the clarion call, the real clarion call is in 8 years, or in 7 years now. But if I follow my colleague's push, it's in 21-22, at that point, our revenues are less than our expenditures. So in the next 2 years, we have to start to build a process that will start to have us think about where we would, how we would value the programming and the budgeting that we're doing, and where we might want to trade off, reduce, invest more.
Approach attrition that will naturally happen over the next so many years, right? Like,
correct. So in some ways, I think although the clearing call is in 24-25, and where Kathy was saying that we will have $5 million left of the referendum dollars, I think the 21-22 year, we need to be well on the way, and sort of 21-22 and 22-23 are the really vital years to make some important decisions on investments and important decisions on trade-offs, and then important decisions on reductions. And it's important, actually, just thinking out loud, it's important to say it that way, because these are about investments. Where if we invest, when we make our investments, do we believe as an educational institution we're going to have the greatest, if I may, bang for our buck? And that's going to be really important. And we may want to, and in that case, we may want to spend more in particular areas. But we do have to pay attention to how we balance that off over time.
Can I just jump in and say, I feel like it's such a important goal for us to move towards. Like, it seems like the referendum is almost irrelevant, right? Like, it's still taxpayer money that's being spent, and we should be making sure that we're getting the biggest bang for our buck across the board.
Correct.
So I would push that, have that done as quickly as possible.
although I do appreciate not wanting that conversation to muddy the faithful negotiation conversation as well.
Well, why wouldn't it clarify instead of muddying it? I feel like if you have a good faith conversation with the union on how to approach this, it could be a win-win as opposed to it being a sticking point.
Yeah.
Optimistic.
And I think I would just echo that those conversations need to start happening earlier, as early as possible. The city of Evanston did the survey, priority-based budgeting survey, and I'm curious if we would consider doing that so that the community has a say. When we did the referendum, we put out what would be cut, and I think that there was a big sense of people just not having a voice on how that was decided, and could we start that conversation early? I think you know best what areas we could, get the biggest bang for our buck. And I think the earlier that we can start having those conversations with our community as part of the, the effort to do the September educational pieces, I think if there's any way we could start that conversation as early as possible so that the community has an insight as to what we would consider.
I guess related to that, I would just add, we're making, and we probably have other questions too, but because it's related to what Rebecca said, we're making investments in this budget. And I think we need to do a really good job of explaining, because if I just put my finance hat on and I look at a 7% budget increase relative to a 1% increase in enrollment, it doesn't scream strong financial stewardship. But when you unwrap it and you talk about, we need to talk about which components of those are investments based on, our strategic promises and our commitments to student success and equity, which components are, maintaining the ship, and which components are in reaction to increased need, because we are seeing still population growth and increased need. But I think we need to dissect it that way, and also look at it, I would add, show information relative to last year's budget as well as actuals, because I think it's a little bit deceptive to show it just relative to actuals last year, especially in staffing, when we went without certain staff for a significant amount of time, didn't staff those positions. So it looks like somehow you're ballooning, and it's really a timing issue. Commitments were made, we couldn't fulfill on those commitments, so we're gonna fulfill on them now. So it's not like there's huge staffing increases, it's just, so, you know, it's helpful, I think, for people to see things relative to the previous budget, because just in high-level numbers, if you look relative to the budget, there's a 4%, you know, 3% increase in salaries, right? Versus a 5% increase in salaries. So, so clearly there's just some differences there. I think for me, and I would assume people who aren't that close to this, that would help you understand why there's.
And for that very reason, actually, we added, there is a new information in the detail, in the details and also in the summaries. There is a comparison to actual, but there's also comparison with the budget. And especially if you look at the expenditure, if you compare it to the budget, the increase is not as high.
Right.
Because again, we had a lot of unfilled positions, or we had.
You had the capital outlays.
Yes.
There's, you know, there's a lot to explain it.
So
So
that's.
I would encourage us to do that in kind of the graphs and stuff too, because that's the pieces that will stay with people. The visual is much less than the narrative.
I just think it's an exceptional goal that you put in writing. And I think it's a long runway, like there's room for some turbulence, but like, to Becca's point, like, if we want community engagement, we need to kind of spend time talking about how do we want that to look? How do we want to receive feedback from the community? How do we want them to, how do we want to engage in that way? What does that look like both for the administration, for us as board members? Like, there's conversations that will take time to figure out, and it's a great goal. But it's not a one-year goal. But we got to start talking about it now because it's a longer than one-year conversation.
That's right.
And it's not easy to do and actually get valuable input, right?
Right.
You know, because you have to construct it in such a way that people can respond. I mean, you have to know what trade-offs are. Like, so there's in isolation, what do you think is most important? Which I think is probably where we are more right now. It's not at the point of the referendum, it was a trade-off situation.
Right, and then you're up against the clock, and I think, I mean, we've been talking about it for a little while. I think we're ripe for that conversation, even though it stirs communication in the community, but that's not always a bad thing if we've got conduits for communication built in to receive feedback and kind of get a lay of the land.
And again, that's where the little arrow that Kathy put on the chart for 21-22 is essential. And so that's really, from there, backward mapping and then figuring out a process that makes sense is going to be important.
Okay.
I think I would just also add, in thinking about the conversation about these new policies, is really making sure there's a shared understanding of what instructional value is, who is defining that, how is it being defined, who are the people who are helping to make that definition, whether it's administration and staff and community. I just think that it's very nebulous to me when I look at those two words of instructional value, and I would bet to say we all might have a difference of opinion. And so I think, yes, we've gone through this process many times, but I think there has to be a shared understanding of how we are defining and who is defining that, why did, and making sure that we are always including all the stakeholders who are going to be impacted by the definition. But so I think that's really important.
Important point. And maybe that's where we start. I mean,
well, maybe since you put it on there as a goal, like what does it mean, instructional value? Is that when I look at the slide on 10, where it says direct service to students, is that where instructional value is defined, or was there a definition in mind or no?
I don't think we're there yet. But I do think that, I mean, but we have larger value. I mean, the values of we want all of our children to perform at the highest levels, and we want to actually be very focused on the opportunity gaps that we have so that we can accelerate the learning of those who are striving to achieve, and while maintaining the levels of those who are right now as high achievers. Then that becomes our equity agenda as well.
Yeah.
I think another value we had, and again, without getting into the deep debate now, because it's important to have, is around class size. And when we drove the issues around the referendum, we made the claim that the community values class sizes at the level that they are, with the factors that we have. That becomes a very big question as we move forward. If you look to 24, 25, the class sizes we have now can't maintain a budget as we're expending now after 24, 25. So we have to put some value on that too. And then class sizes at what levels. We've had a lot of conversation around this table around our pre-K and our K, our early education. Is that a value that we want to place? We have a lot of questions around literacy that we've been working on. So again, I can go on and on, but I think these are, Meg, you're spot on. I think we want to unpack what that means and sort of build not only a consensus, but a sort of a belief in the values that we have so that we can drive the budgetary conversation.
Well, and I think I keep going back to this shared understanding,
Yeah.
so that if you can create this shared understanding with collective voices, then you may have less community angst, if you will, around where those tough choices may come.
Yeah.
And there may be better understanding of the investments, as you refer to them, and where those are being prioritized, right? Because you're starting with everybody on the same page, is what I wonder. And then can I just a question or a thought about the community events that you're having? I'm hoping, because there's no specific times, that there will be a variety of dates and
They actually
times,
posted.
because that is up for many schools, open houses that week too. And hopefully that we can invite teachers as well and staff to be able to come so that they're also aware of what's happening.
From 6:30 to 8.
Okay.
And part of the issue is that we have to do it long enough before the final
Right.
day to
Right.
approve the budget, so that if there are any inputs that we found compelling, we may want to change the tentative budget that we presented to the committee today. So that's what it is. There's a fine window.
And I totally understand that. I just wanted to be mindful is that we do have open houses as well, so that may impact community participation. You know, we always have something going on, so I know that's a challenge. Just providing options for engagement.
Yeah.
It was just a
Maybe
wondering.
even considering a Saturday session. That week, those weeks in September are super busy, and I know that there's people that wanted to attend, but just couldn't on an evening, and I don't know if we could somehow consolidate maybe to a Saturday morning. I know that's cutting into your weekend, but if we're able to communicate this information and have a better attended session, just something for consideration.
Could it be done virtually also?
Yes, that would be great.
Yeah, I was thinking like a podcast or something,
Yeah,
that
you could
if there was
record it,
something
yeah.
that maybe we could put on the website so that for teachers who are interested, and I know we're gonna get so many people who are gonna wanna come to this.
Can you even set it up so people can ask
This meeting
questions?
is.
But I don't know, I know, but it just as many options as possible to make sure.
Well, and that's, I want to give Raphael and Kathy credit from last year. Prior to the last year, we didn't do any of these things. And so, and that was coming in new, having a fresh perspective, also right on top of the referendum. So there's these are great suggestions, and then trying to figure out within the parameters of the requirements of posting how we do it.
So I think what I'm hearing is that there's a push and encouragement to start having these thoughtful discussions before fiscal year '21. Yeah. And that we involve as many voices as possible in the discussion. And I think one of the things that also, we had talked about this a little bit before, when we had the discussion during the referendum, there were a lot of voices that suggested that they would help with problem solving. And creative solution finding. And so I think that that is the other benefit to having the discussion as early as possible, is not just offering input into the difficult decisions and developing some collective buy-in, but also possibly finding some solutions that we may not think of without those extra voices.
Great. I have one or two other questions. The big one is kind of related to what Anya's question, which is on the slide that has the projections. And I did not go back to find the earlier versions, but my big question when I look at this year's budget, beyond, what we talked about already and how we break down those increases and stuff is are we banking the amount that we committed to bank this year to go to future deficits? Are we banking at least that much? If, banking more, that's great. And by that I mean, it says 3 million here. Is that what we had said we were going to put away previously? So irrespective of how we've developed the current year budget, and we have made some increases that we, whatever, it's a plan of how we're going to spend our money, are we still staying true to, and we were spending money in particular ways that we said we would for the referendum, but are we still staying true to the balance?
Yes, actually our projections look better. They look better especially to our first projections that we shown after the referendum was approved in February of 2018. The number in the corner used to be 2.6 million, now it's 5.5. And with these
when you
additional,
say the number in the corner.
with these additional revenues paid by the state this year, we had 14.4. I think surplus project that we got a lot more. I think we're doing a lot better, and we banking that money into our reserves. So yes, we are on track, actually much better than we initially anticipated.
And again, because Candace, you and other board members have asked us each time we presented, we made a promise to the community. That's what the small print promise is. And so what we're arguing is that we're meeting that promise.
Yes.
I'm sorry, when you say the number in the corner, what do you
It's the
Corner.
five.
The next slide.
Um,
It's on page
Oh,
12
yes.
of your overhead. It's the next slide. It's the balance.
So it's the balance of the referendum reserves in FY25, which right now is at 5.5 million. But originally, when we did the projections, it was only 2.6.
Right. And I get that we did much better than we thought we were this past fiscal year. I'm just asking this, so forget about that, because I'm just wanting to keep building and building. This year, irrespective of what happened last year, this year, are we putting as much in as we had planned to put in, just to account for future deficits?
Yes, I mean, I do not have the details with me from those original projections, but again, we initially, what we had in our projection was just the budgeted amount of the surplus. We know that we did much better by 4 million, so that's went to the bank because of that. And probably, I mean, again, I don't have these figures with me, and these are projections, so they're gonna be constantly, this is very fluid. It's gonna be changing constantly, but again, just looking at this number, we know that we are on track, and we're banking more what we initially promised to the.
So maybe it would just be helpful to, same thing as I need, like for one-to-one, just to be able to see. I'm looking for the net reserve number, what we said we were going to be accumulating and adding each year, and then.
But we never really had a specific amount because it was based on the assumptions that we knew would change.
I know, but it was that was what we were assuming at the time, at least
We can
relative
compare
to
with the
those
original
assumptions, knowing what we're doing,
assumptions.
so that we can just see.
Sure, yeah.
And-
We can do that.
It also would clarify the fluctuation.
Yeah, that was the, right then was, at a point in
Oh, we can
time,
do
we
that.
thought that how is the reality happening compared to that? We want to make sure our reality is as good, if hopefully better, than what we thought back then. That's
It
all
would
I'm
also quantify the fluidity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But with all being said, though, I will go back and say, really, our solution to this problem, the community solution to this problem going forward, is to make sure we don't have a deficit budget. I mean, that's really, if we really want to prevent, because this is only buying us a short term. And with accumulating deficit, what happens is it gets faster very quickly. The amount grows very quickly. The more deficit. If you look at it in FY22, we start out with 367. And then the following year, we're looking at 3 million. So the solution is, and then if you look at it, and then the following year it goes to 6.3. And the year after that it goes to 9.5. So I really think what we should be focusing on is making sure that when we have a budget, without regards to how much of the referendum we have, revenue always matches expenditure.
So,
Yeah, I guess that,
I don't disagree with that, but I would just say the last very public conversation that probably most people remember of the District 65 budget is the referendum. And that particular slide that we're referring to probably is stuck in our heads because we presented it several times. And I think that even though it is a snapshot and it may not be what stands out as the most important benchmark for you as our CFO, for many people in the community it is an important benchmark, and I think, yeah, and I'm not suggesting that you're discounting it. I'm just suggesting that it's important that we do figure out a way to offer that comparison, because for a lot of people, when they voted yes for the referendum, what they were saying is we vote for us not having those problems in that chart.
That's not a problem. I mean, we can use it as a starting point, and because that was the public information, and compare it with the changing reality, like you said, and what we currently storing.
There's also an important point in the questions, which is that these resources that we have in reserve are in reserve for a purpose, and that we're not going to spend those resources. And we have parameters set by the board that we are obligated to preserve these resources as we go forward. And so that's a really important. So sometimes I worry about the language of surplus. Yes, technically there's a surplus, but that surplus buys us the opportunity to maintain and grow at a small level our programming over time until we reach the point where revenues are not matching expenditures, and then we reach a point 7 years from now where if we haven't made the adjustments and hadn't done the work that we're suggesting we would do, we're really in a budget mess at that point.
Financial planning will tell us that we should have no less than 30% of the expenditure in a given year in reserves. So that should be our flow, maybe 30%, because there's so many unknowns with funding of school districts. It can easily be, even though the state passed the evidence-based funding, but that's also tied into appropriation. It can easily be 2 years from now. The state says, yeah, we have that, but we don't have the appropriation passed to fund that. So we need those reserves because of unknowns. There's so many unknowns. Legislation comes in all the time that is trying to transfer what is being state responsibility to the community. So by having those reserves, it allows us to be able to consistently operate and fund our school without having to make some crazy borrowing. There are a lot of school districts. So I want us to start speaking the same language and recognize that a true balanced budget is one where revenue and expenditure matches, not one where we're using reserves to balance the budget. And so if you look at this projection and we say we have a balanced budget in the out years, but we really don't. The last year when we were a balanced budget, based on the current projection, would be FY21. And after that, we fall off the cliff. And we fall off very, very quickly.
so I guess playing devil's advocate, that we are contributing to that though now by increasing expenses. So,
But
and a portion of that is obligated, that we have to, but we're making choices right now in this budget because those sustain themselves.
In reality, if we want to be honest and have an honest conversation, the savings that we can realize is tied into people. Because as you see, fully 80% of the expenditure is people. So even if we cut 20% of the expenditure, which is not related to people, which is not possible, but if we did that, we still have a problem in the out years. So what we have to do is start now thinking about how we can reduce people.
Get that, but I'm looking at a budget that's increasing our staff by 20 people, right? So there's, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't be increasing our staff by 20 people, but we're kind of, we're doing both things. So that's why we have to be, that's one of the reasons why I think having this, even though we are adding positions, we are still at minimum keeping to the commitments that we've made is really important to the community. And many of these positions were also part of the commitments we made to the community, in terms of our investments, in ELL, our equity investments, et cetera. But at some point, we added 30 positions last year. If we added 19 positions this year, that's 50 positions in 2 years. We can't maintain that increase.
On a positive note, our fund balance is at 35%, and I don't think our district had ever had that kind of fund balance. So I think this is a positive, and it should be reflected in our future Moody's ratings and cost of borrowing, but this is a very positive, I think.
Well, there's a lot of positive. I don't mean to be negative. Like
no,
on
I
page
know,
14,
and I agree with you.
The structural
100%.
deficits, that slide. If you look back to 2018-19, our gap was like this, right? And we're getting it within 2%. That's a huge, huge improvement in our ability to sustain our finances. We just have to keep working on it.
I also don't mean to be negative, but it's like when you maintain your house, right? You do a Band-Aid, you do a Band-Aid, you do a Band-Aid. 5 years later, you do the expensive real fix, and you're like, gosh, I should have done that 5 years ago and saved myself time, money, and a headache. If there's ideas that we can be doing sooner, before we have to talk about program staffing, whatever, let's have that conversation and get those things going as soon as possible. Because we just need the time to think about them, hear the recommendations, and know where it's coming from.
Well, I think that's where, around this table and in our conversations, we talked after the referendum about the 8 years that we have. And indeed, yes, we have 7 more years, but really the key points are coming up upon us soon. And so we have to start thinking about those choices as soon as possible.
And I loved it, I think it was in April, Raphael, when you were telling us the way you were thinking out loud for us at a board meeting, how you were going about renegotiating certain contracts and services that we have for the district. And in my head, I simplistically am like, oh, you can go rebid everything, right? And you're like, no, there's a method to it, and it's, you can't do everything in 1 year, so you take it piece by piece, and over a course of several years, you can go through all the vendors and then make your way around again. But that's great transparency for the community and for us to know how that works. Because we know that you're doing it, we trust that you're doing it, you've shared it with us, and and the way that you're doing it is efficient and effective, right? And then occasionally you bring us a budget that has savings in some of those areas.
And yet the flip of that is that for instance, in our bus transportation costs going up, part of this was that the provider that we were working with a year ago was on the edge of going bankrupt, and the quality of service and then the ability to actually run their operation was quite wobbly. And so we've gone with a different company where we can actually have services that will pick up our children and drive them safely to school.
To the extent that we were actually the one buying the commercial operations for it.
Yeah, we had to.
And then deducting the money from the invoice. And that was not sustainable.
Yeah.
We have to check every month how they pay their premium. No, we have to deduct it from the invoice.
And that's the thing, there are things that you guys are doing to create efficiencies, and I think it's healthy in our cycle of meetings to get those updates as well, so that we know that that's happening So that, right, the assumption isn't that you're just spinning your wheels waiting for the conversation to happen.
Right.
There are things happening, and we need the little wins too to know that we're moving in the right direction.
Anyone else? No. Thank you both.
This is very helpful.
Thank you all for
Thank you.
all the
Thank you
work
for your questions.
and the presentation. Very helpful. So, unless there are any questions about the FYIs, we can adjourn the meeting. Finance Committee, our next Finance Committee meeting is September 17th, and that will be after the public sessions. So we'll have, some information from that and input and as a precursor to the final budget approval. And I will adjourn the meeting at 7:14 p.m. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yay.